This is Alex from VoiceCast, and if you're hearing this, the world you once knew is no more. The internet, the vast interconnected web that once connected us all, has gone dark. Cities are without power, banks wiped clean, communication networks completely obliterated, and as the lights flicker out across the globe, something far darker is lurking behind it all. Cyber warfare, a silent war waged in the shadows, has torn our world apart. It started with a whisper, a crackling sound in the background of our digital lives. But that whisper soon grew into a roar, one that shattered the illusion of security we once took for granted. One moment, you were checking your bank balance or scrolling through social media. The next, everything went black. No warning, no explanation. Cities that were once humming with the pulse of technology are now eerily quiet. Streets that used to buzz with traffic are now deserted. As people scramble to understand the magnitude of what's just happened, the news outlets, which we once relied on for truth, are now silent. Their broadcasts interrupted by static, or worse, by foreign agents with their own twisted agenda. The entire world is paralyzed as one by one the systems we thought we could trust crumble before our eyes. In the span of just a few hours, the financial world crumbled. Banks that were once pillars of security are now nothing more than ghost towns. No one can access their funds. No one can make a transaction. You can't pay for gas. You can't buy food. The economy, once a carefully orchestrated system of exchanges, is in total freefall. As the lights go out, people flood the streets. Panic spreads faster than any virus could. People are asking themselves, is my personal information still safe? Are my accounts compromised? Are the authorities even capable of stopping this? And then, the silence. The eerie silence that settled in after the internet went dark. It's as though a veil has been pulled over the world, and for the first time in history, we're faced with a reality we've never truly imagined. We've lost control. The few remaining communication networks are flooded with confusion and uncertainty. Social media, once our window into the world, is now filled with questions, rumors, and pleas for help. The truth? No one knows what's happening. No one knows how to stop it. The digital infrastructure that has become the lifeblood of our societies is crumbling in real time, and no one, not a single person, knows who's behind it. So here's the question we need to face together. When the digital world goes dark, when everything we've built on the internet crumbles to dust, where do we go from here? Are we capable of surviving this cyber apocalypse, or have we become too reliant on technology to function in a world without it? Stay with me, survivors. The story of how we got here is about to unfold. And believe me, it's not just the lights that are out. Our very way of life is in the balance. It began quietly. For weeks, there had been whispers in the corners of the tech world, hidden beneath layers of noise, strange anomalies in the data streams, unexplained glitches in secure communications. But these were treated as minor disturbances, nothing that would ever be taken seriously. It wasn't until the chaos erupted that anyone understood how far it had gone. The dark web, that mysterious and often ignored underbelly of the internet, had been quietly gathering its strength. Hackers exploiting global vulnerabilities. The first signs of something being wrong came from the most unlikely of places, the banks. It started in the financial sector, where the first breach was detected, systems froze, transactions went unprocessed. The stock market, which had seemed as solid as ever, suddenly began to tumble, but not due to economic reasons. No, this was something far darker. A massive, coordinated cyber assault had begun, targeting critical financial infrastructure. Hackers had found vulnerabilities in the global banking systems and exploited them with ruthless precision. What followed was an avalanche. Entire power grids, which had always been seen as invulnerable to outside attack, began to flicker and go down. One city after another fell into darkness as electric grids were hijacked, and there was no way to restore power. It wasn't just a hack. It was systematic sabotage, a cyber assault that incapacitated entire nations. But this wasn't the work of common criminals. No, this was a well-orchestrated operation carried out by a rogue group, a collective of cyber terrorists whose names were unknown to most. Some believed it was a coalition of hackers, a shadowy network operating from the depths of the dark web. Others speculated it was the work of a rogue artificial intelligence, born out of the chaos of automated code and quantum computing gone astray. Whatever it was, the attack was sophisticated, and it was relentless. The arsenal of the attackers was terrifying in its complexity. The first wave was composed of malware, which spread through the internet like a virus, infecting devices around the world. Once it was inside a system, the malware would silently take control, siphoning off data and locking out users. But that was just the beginning. Ransomware, a malicious software that encrypts a victim's files and demands payment for their release, quickly became the weapon of choice. Businesses, governments, and individuals found themselves locked out of their own information. Personal data, bank records, and even medical histories were held hostage. Payment was demanded in cryptocurrencies, a decentralized, untraceable currency, perfect for this kind of warfare. As millions of people scrambled to access their accounts or basic services, they were met with a horrifying reality. Everything they thought was secure was now in the hands of unseen forces. But it didn't stop there. A new threat emerged: distributed denial of service DOS attacks. These attacks flooded networks with so much traffic that they became overwhelmed, shutting down everything from communications networks to military defense systems. Websites were unreachable, emergency services were offline, and all critical operations were halted. The global systems that had been built over decades were now reduced to rubble, and the most terrifying part was that no one knew who was behind it. Were these attacks the work of a government, a private group, or something far more sinister? The answers would come later, but the damage was done. AI and quantum computing, breaking through security protocols. As the attacks grew more sophisticated, it became clear that artificial intelligence and quantum computing had played a major role in bypassing the most advanced security systems in the world. Traditional cybersecurity measures, which had once been considered impregnable, were useless in the face of these new technologies. Quantum computing, capable of processing vast amounts of data at speeds far beyond conventional computers, could crack encryption codes that would normally take years to break. The attackers seemed to be one step ahead at every turn. They used AI to adapt to countermeasures, learning from each system they infiltrated and growing stronger with each breach. This wasn't just a cyber attack, it was a cyber war, and it was being waged on a scale no one had ever imagined. Amidst the chaos, there were those who saw the warning signs and tried to raise the alarm, only to be ignored. I noticed the anomalies in the system long before everything fell apart, said David, an IT professional who had worked with global financial institutions for over a decade. There were strange patterns, unexplained data spikes, files that couldn't be accessed, security protocols being bypassed with ease. I tried to flag it. I tried to warn the higher-ups, but no one listened. They thought I was paranoid, that it was nothing more than a glitch. But I knew something was coming, and when it hit, it was too late. David's voice cracked with the weight of what he had witnessed. He wasn't the only one who had been ignored. In offices, homes, and government buildings, IT professionals across the globe had seen the signs, but no one had acted fast enough to stop the storm. For others, the collapse was more personal. I woke up one morning to find our bank accounts emptied, said Sarah, a mother of two who had been forced to watch her life crumble. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but then I realized it was everywhere. The news was full of reports from people saying the same thing. Money was gone. Credit cards were useless. We couldn't buy food, pay bills, or even keep the lights on. I couldn't even contact my parents. The phone lines were down, and there were no answers. No one knew what was happening. It It was like the entire world just stopped working. Sarah's family was just one of thousands who had their financial livelihoods erased overnight. But this wasn't just about money, it was about survival. As the dark web attack continued to unfold, it became clear that this was no random act of cybercrime. The attackers had orchestrated a sophisticated, multi-layered assault designed to bring society to its knees. The very systems that humanity had come to rely on were being torn apart, and no one knew who would be left standing when the dust finally settled. The darkness wasn't just a literal one. It was the collapse of everything. The systems that had governed the world, from finance to healthcare, had relied on an invisible web of connections. As the cyber attack continued to spread, it was as though the very foundation of society had been yanked out from under our feet. The interconnectedness of the modern world, which had once been its greatest strength, became its ultimate vulnerability. The first major casualty was the global economy. It began with a few inexplicable disruptions in financial systems, small glitches in transactions, a few delayed payments, but that quickly escalated. Soon, financial institutions across the world were compromised, their databases erased or ransomed. Within hours, bank accounts, once considered as secure as vaults, were drained. Credit cards were maxed out without authorization. Entire stock markets came to a screeching halt as trading platforms were hijacked, sending share prices into free fall. Investors, who had once thrived in this digital marketplace, found themselves scrambling to understand what had happened. The financial system, once an abstract yet trusted entity, was now nothing more than an empty shell. Citizens who had once relied on the digital age for their livelihood were now left stranded. Payments for rent, utilities, and basic goods could no longer be processed. The entire concept of wealth and resources had turned into a nightmare of confusion and uncertainty. People stood in front of ATMs, waiting for cash that would never come. What followed was a complete breakdown of trust, as digital currencies lost their value. The already fragile social contract began to dissolve. If the collapse of the economy hadn't been enough, the failure of the energy grids was the final blow. Power outages began in major cities. A few minutes at first, then hours, and before long, entire regions were plunged into darkness. It was as though someone had flicked off a switch, leaving millions of people in total blackness. The effects of the blackout were far-reaching. Hospitals, factories, and residential buildings all came to a standstill. Power companies scrambled, but their attempts to restore power were thwarted by the sophistication of the cyber attack. The attackers had penetrated not just the power grid systems, but also the protocols that had once protected them. No one knew who or what was behind the breach, but the results were the same. Society had lost its pulse. The silence that followed was deafening. Without electricity, refrigeration ceased, food spoiling in warehouses and supermarkets. Communication networks had failed, leaving people isolated. Panic spread, especially in the larger cities. Citizens, already grappling with the economic collapse, now faced a world that seemed determined to push them into anarchy. As if the cascading collapse wasn't enough, the healthcare systems, which so many had come to rely on, were also taken hostage. Hospitals across the world found themselves under siege, their data erased or locked away behind unbreakable encryption. Patient records, which doctors once accessed in an instant, were now lost in the void. The healthcare sector, the last lifeline for many, was rendered useless. In the midst of the chaos, doctors and nurses were still fighting to save lives, but they were doing so blindfolded. Imagine trying to treat a patient without knowing their medical history, allergies, or medications. The situation in emergency rooms across the globe became a nightmare. Hospitals without power were forced to work with limited resources, relying on backup generators that failed to keep up with the growing demands. With power grids down and hospitals paralyzed, the ripple effects of the collapse quickly spread to other critical areas. Food supply chains were disrupted almost immediately. Trucks, once able to travel vast distances on precise schedules, now found themselves stranded. Smart vehicles, reliant on GPS and route planning algorithms, were rendered useless when those systems were hacked. Farmers, who had already been struggling to adapt to climate instability, now faced their own set of challenges as they watched their crops spoil in storage facilities with no way to transport them. Water supplies, too, began to dwindle. Cities with sophisticated water treatment systems, reliant on technology for their efficiency, found themselves in desperate need of alternatives. The technology that had once made cities so advanced was now the very thing that made them vulnerable. In the midst of the chaos, individual stories of survival painted a much darker, personal picture of the world's collapse. Take Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a trauma surgeon at a major hospital in Los Angeles. The day the attack began, she was in the ER, dealing with a routine shift. By the time she noticed something was wrong, it was too late. The computers were down. Her team couldn't access any patient records, and soon the backup systems failed too. What followed was a terrifying scramble to keep patients alive without any reliable information. "We were working with a fraction of what we used to have," she said in an interview later. "There were people who could have been saved if we'd known their medical history. But we didn't. I don't know how many we lost because of it." Meanwhile, far from the hospital, trucker James Harlow was facing a different kind of struggle. He had a load of perishable goods, vegetables and dairy, that needed to get to a distribution center across state lines. But when his GPS failed, he found himself stranded on a highway, unable to contact anyone. The roads were full of other truckers facing the same issue. No one knew which direction to go, and no one had fuel to spare. "We were just stuck out there," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "No power, no communications, no way to help. What good are trucks if you can't deliver anything?" It was clear to everyone now what had started as a cyber attack was now a full-scale collapse of modern civilization. The interconnectedness that had once allowed us to live in relative comfort had now become a crumbling house of cards. One system fell, and they all began to crumble in tandem, just like dominoes. No one had been ready for it. No one had anticipated that the very tools that had made life so easy could be turned against them. And yet, here we were, in a world where everything depended on systems that had failed. The internet, once our greatest asset, was now our most formidable enemy. The collapse wasn't just a technical failure, it was a human tragedy. What do you do when you can't trust the very systems that kept society running? How do you move forward when the tools of survival have been taken from you? As the darkness of the collapse settled in, one thing became painfully clear. Humanity's reliance on interconnected systems had both saved us and doomed us. We had built a world on the assumption that these systems would always be there, that they were as essential as the air we breathed. Now, with the collapse of the most basic systems, humanity was left to grapple with an uncertain future, where survival was no longer a certainty, but a daily struggle. The world had never been more connected or more fragile. When the digital systems that everyone relied on were hacked and destroyed, it was like the foundation of society was ripped away. The very thing that had made the modern world so convenient, instant access to money, food, transportation, information, was gone. What followed was not just a technological collapse, but the collapse of the human psyche, as people realized they were living in a world that could no longer be trusted. The immediate aftermath was sheer panic. People who had always felt secure, who had believed that their wealth, their resources, and their identity were protected by layers of digital encryption and systems they didn't fully understand, suddenly found themselves exposed. The banking system, once a fortress of trust, became a void. People streamed into their local branches, their fingers frantically pressing the screens of their smartphones, trying to withdraw their savings or transfer money, only to be met with errors, or worse, Blank screens. One by one, the financial institutions went down, leaving people scrambling for any physical currency they could get their hands on. But without power, ATMs didn't work. Without digital transactions, online stores shut down. And as the days passed, the money people once depended on became useless. Food scarcity soon followed. Grocery stores that once had aisles stocked with fresh produce and packaged goods now stood eerily empty. People fought over the last remaining cans of beans and bags of rice. The shelves that had once been orderly and well stocked were now ransacked by desperate hands. It wasn't just about food, medicine, gasoline, water. Every essential resource was in short supply, and the pressure was mounting. Some communities turned to barter, trading whatever they had left. A bottle of water for a can of beans. A packet of batteries for a flashlight. As days turned into weeks, the situation worsened. The economy, once driven by billions of online transactions every second, was now reduced to a series of isolated islands, where people could only survive on what they had on hand or what they could fight for. As the global infrastructure crumbled, governments struggled to respond. National leaders, once seemingly omnipotent in their ability to control economies and protect their citizens, were now paralyzed. Their communication lines were down, their ability to coordinate an effective response shattered. Military units, typically able to enforce order during a crisis, now found their own communication networks compromised. Orders could not be transmitted. Coordination was impossible. In the absence of clear leadership, local authorities tried to fill the gap, but their efforts were disorganized and haphazard. Some cities declared martial law, but without communication or functioning systems to support them, the police and military were often as helpless as the civilians they were meant to protect. The world became a series of disconnected regions, each scrambling to survive in a vacuum of law and order. In the most densely populated areas, chaos was inevitable. It wasn't long before riots erupted across the world's major cities. People, once content to live their lives in the comfort of modernity, now found themselves fighting for their basic needs. The supermarket shelves, once full of consumer goods, were now barren. The streets, once full of commuters rushing to work, were now battlegrounds. A wave of looting spread like wildfire across urban centers. Once pristine neighborhoods saw windows smashed, stores raided, and cars set on fire. The government response was slow, and in some places, entirely non-existent. In the chaos, it was clear. Survival was no longer about wealth or status. It was about brute force, the ability to secure resources, and most importantly, the ability to trust those around you, or more often, to trust no one at all. The psychological toll of these events began to manifest itself. People who had once been calm and rational found themselves breaking into stores for food, fighting with neighbors, or simply hoarding what little they had left. The fear of starvation or violence was constant. And as communication systems failed, people were left isolated, cut off from any form of collective security. The only information they had came from unreliable sources, rumors, whispers, and the occasional voice on a shortwave radio. In a world that was increasingly dangerous, uncertainty was the one thing that everyone could count on. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this breakdown was the psychological toll it took on people. For many, the idea that technology could fail, that systems they had trusted without question could crumble, was an unsettling experience. The world, once predictable, had become a place of overwhelming uncertainty. One of the most dangerous byproducts of the collapse was the erosion of trust. Friends turned on friends. Neighbors, once considered safe, became threats. The very concept of personal identity, built on digital information and a connected life, began to fall apart. Without the digital networks that once verified their existence, Many people began to question whether they even knew who they were anymore. Were they the sum of their bank accounts, their social media profiles, their credit scores? In a world where all that was gone, who were they? In the absence of clear leadership and trustworthy information, paranoia spread like a virus. Who could you trust? People began turning on each other, not just for food and supplies, but for safety. In the streets, it was clear. Survival often meant suspicion. The very fabric of communities began to unravel, as once friendly neighborhoods became zones of tension and mistrust. Some survivors, faced with these overwhelming fears, began to retreat into their own private worlds. In the absence of any societal structure, people tried to recreate their own systems of order. But these new micro-communities were fragile. They were built on suspicion, not trust. And without the stabilizing force of digital systems, people were left grappling with their own survival, torn between desperation and the lingering hope that society could somehow pull itself together. In the middle of a city teetering on the edge of collapse, there was Sarah, a school teacher. She had always taught her students about cooperation, empathy, and trust. But when the riots began, her school was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah gathered her students, trying to keep them calm as she led them out of the building. The streets were filled with angry mobs, and the once bustling city had become a war zone. Her instinct to protect the children, to keep them safe, had never been stronger. But as she maneuvered through the streets, her thoughts turned darker. Would she be able to protect them? Would they even survive the night? Then there was Mark, a former hacker, who had always lived in the shadows of the digital world. He was one of the early adopters of the dark web and had watched with growing anxiety as his fellow hackers escalated the chaos. At first, he dismissed it as a series of isolated events. But when the attack spread and everything went dark, Mark couldn't deny his role in it anymore. Though he hadn't orchestrated the attack himself, his understanding of the dark web made him realize that his community, the world of cyber terrorists and rogue hackers, had escalated things beyond control. The crisis was personal now. He had helped open the door to this nightmare. As chaos swirled around them, one question kept echoing in the minds of all survivors. Would society ever return to order? Or was this the new reality? The cracks in the system had grown too deep to mend easily, and with every passing day, the trust that had once held humanity together seemed more fragile than ever. People were beginning to understand that the world they had once taken for granted, the world built on digital convenience and connectivity, might never return. The world had gone dark, not in the way most people thought of darkness, but in a more insidious, invisible sense. The digital realm that once defined modern civilization was now silent, a void that swallowed everything from financial systems to communication networks. As the days turned into weeks, survivors found themselves struggling, not just to survive, but to make sense of a world where everything they had taken for granted no longer existed. In this new world, the rules were simple: adapt or perish. Without the internet, without banks, and without any digital means of exchanging goods, society had to return to its most primitive systems of trade. Money, as most people had once known it, became nothing more than scraps of paper. People couldn't rely on credit cards, PayPal, or any form of electronic currency. What had once been digital wallets and transactions became physical objects and tangible assets: food, clean water, tools, and medicine. Trading became the lifeblood of survival. At first, people hoarded anything they could get their hands on: canned goods, weapons, batteries, and fire-starting tools. But soon, it became clear that the only way to survive was to share, to barter. A group of survivors might trade a few cans of tuna for some firewood, or a flash drive loaded with essential survival information for a bag of rice. The most valuable currency in this new world wasn't the dollars or euros in your bank account. It was the ability to offer something tangible in exchange for something you needed. The most successful survivors were those who had the foresight to stash away non-perishable goods or tools that could be used for trade. One such survivor, Claire, had always been a prepper, stockpiling supplies just in case. When the attack happened, her careful preparations allowed her to survive and even thrive while others around her struggled. With the collapse of digital finance systems, Claire quickly became a key figure in her community, trading cans of food for fresh water, for firewood, for medicine. What was once a precaution had turned into a lifeline, and Claire found herself not just surviving, but becoming an anchor for others who had not prepared. As the digital age slipped away, so did the conveniences that came with it. Navigation, something so simple as getting from one place to another, had once been a matter of typing an address into Google Maps. Now, without GPS or any reliable form of electronic mapping, people had to relearn old skills, using compasses, reading physical maps, and relying on landmarks they could see with their own eyes. Alex, a former tech company employee, found himself stranded on the outskirts of what was once his city. When the internet went down, he found his car's GPS system useless and his phone screen blank. But it was more than just frustration at being lost. It was the realization that he had no idea how to find his way home. His city had changed so much in the years that he had been reliant on digital tools, and now he was left to navigate by instinct. Armed with an old paper map he found in his glove compartment, Alex set out to retrace his steps. At first, it was disorienting. Streets that used to be recognizable were now dark and empty, and the landmarks he had once relied on were gone. Yet, Alex wasn't alone. Over time, a group of survivors, people who had been left stranded without their devices, began to share resources and knowledge. Together, they learned how to navigate their world the old-fashioned way. By the stars, by the sun, and by the roads that led from one place to another. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fast, but Alex and his group found a new sense of control in navigating a world that had once been too fast-paced to understand. One of the first lessons learned in this new world was the importance of securing safe zones. At first, survivors fled to government shelters and makeshift camps, relying on whatever technology was available to maintain order and safety. But as the weeks wore on and the cyber attacks continued, it became clear that even these systems were vulnerable. Communications were increasingly intercepted, power grids remained unreliable, and no one could trust that the safety of the next camp would be assured. Thus began the era of low-tech survival zones, areas where people gathered to rebuild their lives in relative safety, but with minimal reliance on technology. These zones were simple: fortified buildings with walls, windows boarded up against looters and external threats. Many had no electricity, relying on solar panels or generators when the sun wasn't obscured by the occasional storm. These survivors didn't trust any form of central authority anymore. Instead, they formed small, tight-knit communities where everyone was responsible for contributing to the collective good. In one such zone, Claire, who had once been a digital marketing expert, now helped organize the community's efforts to grow food. She used her old knowledge of self-sustaining practices, from growing vegetables in small makeshift gardens to creating efficient water filtration systems. Claire's leadership and her ability to adapt were emblematic of the resilience displayed by many others in the community. People who had once relied on the internet for every answer now found themselves turning to books, handwritten manuals, and the collective wisdom of the group. Knowledge that had once seemed obsolete was now in high demand. The safe zone itself became an example of survival through cooperation. Each person had a role. Scavengers found supplies in abandoned cities, medics provided care for the sick, and survivors of the attack shared their stories, passing on vital lessons for the next generation. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements, food shortages, and the constant threat of outside dangers. But it was something. It was hope. In the midst of this chaos, there were moments of hope. Communities, once isolated and divided by the digital world, now found themselves coming together. As trade and barter took off, strangers shared what little they had to keep others alive. People started growing their own food, repairing old vehicles, and teaching one another lost skills. Perhaps the most significant moment of hope came from a survivor named Michael, an old librarian who had managed to hold onto a collection of books. One day, he found an offline database, a relic from before the collapse, containing essential survival knowledge. It was a treasure trove of information: how to build shelters, purify water, identify edible plants, and preserve food. This knowledge became invaluable, and Michael shared it with anyone who would listen. In a world that had forgotten how to survive without technology, this was the bridge that helped rebuild communities. Survival in a world without technology was hard, but humanity's ability to adapt, to reimagine, and rebuild is what kept the flame of hope alive. The world may have been without power, without digital tools, without the conveniences of modern life, but the people who survived found new ways to thrive. Through trading, navigating without devices, and creating safe zones with minimal technology, they began to carve out a new future. It wasn't the life they had once known, but it was a life worth living, and for some, that was enough. The first few weeks after the collapse were a blur of chaos and confusion. People had become desperate. Their once bustling lives turned upside down in a matter of hours. But amidst the devastation, a new sense of purpose began to emerge. Where technology had once been humanity's greatest tool, it had now become its most dangerous enemy. Yet, in the face of annihilation, humans refused to bow down. They began to fight back. Ethical hackers and cybersecurity experts, those who had once worked behind the scenes to keep the world's network secure, were now stepping forward to take control. These individuals had once been on the front lines of a quiet war, protecting governments, corporations, and citizens from cyber threats. But now they had become the last line of defense against the rogue attackers that had crippled the world. There was no longer any place for corporate interests or governments to hide. It was a race against time to find the source of the attack and stop it before it destroyed everything. A group of cybersecurity experts, disillusioned by the very systems they had once protected, joined forces in secret. They were a ragtag team made up of former tech giants, small-time hackers, and even whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose the darkest corners of the web. Their goal? To trace the origins of the attack and shut it down before it could inflict irreversible damage. They knew the dark web better than anyone, understood the complex labyrinth of malware, ransomware, and rogue AI systems that had infiltrated the global infrastructure. Their first task was to locate and deactivate the servers controlling critical systems, energy grids, healthcare records, and military communication channels. Each mission was more dangerous than the last, as the attackers had anticipated such a response and fortified their networks with state-of-the-art encryption. As the world's digital networks crumbled, governments scrambled to find ways to maintain some semblance of order. Most communication channels were gone, and military operations had been severely compromised. The only option left for many was to return to analog systems, the very systems that had been obsolete just years before. Governments began to deploy old-fashioned methods of communication, relying on shortwave radios, courier services, and print newspapers. Analog phones and even old fax machines became lifelines for officials trying to coordinate their efforts. These outdated systems, while cumbersome and slow, were immune to the digital assault. They became the backbone of the resistance. A new kind of government emerged from the ashes, one that had to adapt to the reality of the post-digital world. Local leaders, once mere footnotes in the machinery of bureaucracy, became the new rulers. Communities formed alliances, sharing what little they had, fuel, food, medicine, in exchange for protection and resources. It was a system of survival more than governance, but it was a system that gave people hope, a reason to keep fighting. While experts and governments tried to fight the digital war on the front lines, survivors too played a key role in reclaiming what was lost. Small groups of survivors began to organize dangerous missions to retrieve critical data backups from data centers, government buildings, and private companies. These missions were fraught with peril. Rogue AI systems, still functioning despite the cyber attack, had become autonomous sentinels designed to prevent any intrusion. One particular mission, codenamed Operation Phoenix, was led by a small group of civilians who had once worked in tech. They knew where the most secure backups were hidden deep in the vaults of a former government data facility. The mission was dangerous from the start. They would have to navigate through deserted cities, avoiding the remnants of hacking groups still hunting for survivors. But their goal was clear: retrieve the encrypted backup drives that contained critical government and infrastructure data, or risk a future where nothing could be rebuilt. The team fought their way through the remnants of the cyber chaos, infiltrating secure facilities that were once impenetrable. They knew that if they didn't succeed, the battle to restore order might already be lost. As they breached the vault, they found themselves up against an unexpected adversary, a network of autonomous drones left over from military projects that had been hijacked to defend the facility. It was a fight not just for the data, but for survival itself. Among the most courageous were the unsung heroes, those who risked their lives to shut down the rogue servers controlling critical infrastructure. One such mission took place in the heart of an energy grid facility. A group of volunteer engineers, desperate to stop the attacks on the power supply, made their way through a desolate, power-starved city. The server was protected by layers of security, physical and digital, but the hackers hadn't anticipated a direct assault from those who understood the systems better than they did. Led by Michael, a former IT engineer who had seen his entire family lost to the initial wave of attacks, the group made their way into the facility under the cover of night. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the main server room. They knew this was their last chance to prevent further widespread destruction. One mistake, and they would be dead. Or worse, they would fail to stop the attacks, allowing the servers to trigger a full-scale energy collapse. With sweat dripping down their faces, the group cut through the facility's defenses and disabled the servers, but not without consequence. The shutdown triggered an emergency protocol, causing an explosion that set the entire building ablaze. Michael and his team barely escaped with their lives, but they succeeded in shutting down the energy grid's central control server. They had dealt a blow to the attackers, but it was clear that they were just a small part of a much larger machine. In the midst of these dangerous missions, a whistleblower named Claire, a former cyber defense strategist, came forward with explosive information. Having worked closely with government agencies before the collapse, Claire knew who was behind the attack: an anonymous hacker group with access to AI technology so advanced it could break through any digital barrier. Worse, she revealed, the attack had been in the making for years, hidden behind layers of fake identities and subterfuge. She risked everything to reveal the truth: her life, her career, and her freedom. But her revelation was far from a simple truth. It was a dark reality. The attackers were not just rogue hackers. They were part of a global syndicate that had infiltrated governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies. Claire's act of bravery gave survivors the knowledge they needed to fight back, but it also planted a seed of doubt. If the attackers had infiltrated so deeply, could anyone be trusted? As the remnants of society rallied to fight back, one question lingered in the minds of all those who had survived. Can we ever rebuild trust in a world built on digital foundations? The struggle to reclaim control was far from over, and the world that would emerge from the ashes might be one where the digital age once a symbol of progress, would forever be viewed with suspicion. In the aftermath of the cyber war, the world as it was known had become a relic of the past. The once thriving digital landscape, an intricate web that had connected people, ideas, businesses, and governments, was gone, erased in the blink of an eye by the shadowy forces of the dark web. The collapse was complete, leaving humanity to pick up the pieces. But as society began to rebuild, something remarkable started to emerge from the ashes, a rediscovery of what it meant to be human. The days of instant messaging, video calls, and digital transactions were over, replaced by simpler, more tangible ways of living. Survivors who had once relied on the internet to manage every aspect of their lives were now returning to basics. In the absence of electricity and digital communication, people sought refuge in analog systems. Cash, once considered a primitive relic, became the new gold. Local barter systems were established in every town and city. Paper maps replaced GPS, and handwritten letters became the primary form of communication. Post offices, once obsolete in a world of instant email and text messages, were resurrected. For many, the transition was jarring, even uncomfortable. But for others, it felt like a return to a time when life was simpler, more grounded. Governments, too, were forced to adapt. Without the means to rely on digital systems, they turned to analog methods of communication. Shortwave radios became the new medium for announcing policies and updates. Paper-based documentation replaced digital records, and face-to-face meetings took the place of video conferences. Though these systems were slower and less efficient, they were secure, no longer vulnerable to the relentless assault of hackers and rogue AI. But even as humanity found new ways to survive, the scars of the cyber apocalypse ran deep. The digital collapse had not just wiped out physical infrastructure, it had also left a psychological wound that would take years, maybe even decades, to heal. For many, the most painful loss was the disappearance of identity. In a world where people had come to define themselves by their digital presence, the sudden absence of this virtual self left an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Social media profiles, digital portfolios, and email histories, everything that had once captured a person's life story, was gone. For some, this loss of digital identity was a kind of existential crisis. Who were they without their online persona? The fear that had consumed society during the early days of the collapse was still present. Paranoia about digital surveillance, data theft, and manipulation lingered in the minds of the survivors. People became more cautious, more withdrawn. The idea of sharing personal information, once a trivial matter in the days before the collapse, now seemed dangerous, almost reckless. In the absence of technology, trust became a commodity as valuable as food and water. Families, too, felt the psychological toll. In the midst of the chaos, many had been forced to abandon their homes or lose loved ones. They had no way of knowing if they would ever be reunited with friends or if their lost possessions would ever be recovered. In some ways, the world had become a permanent state of limbo. Survivors struggled with the ghosts of their past lives. What had been, what could have been, and what would never be again. Despite the scars and the loss, one undeniable truth began to emerge. Humanity had not been defeated. Even when the digital systems that had once been the backbone of society had crumbled, humans had found a way to endure. The resilience of the human spirit, perhaps more than anything else, was what had kept them moving forward. Communities came together to share resources, protect one another, and rebuild what had been lost. In the absence of the hyper-connected world, people rediscovered their ability to connect with each other in real, tangible ways. Neighbors helped each other clear debris, farmers began to grow food in small community gardens, and families gathered around firelight to tell stories of the past, of the world that was. In some corners of the world, these small acts of kindness and cooperation were enough to form the foundation of new communities. ones that valued relationships and mutual support over technology. For the first time in years, people were learning to rely on each other again. And while it wasn't easy, it was enough. And yet, even in the midst of this fragile renewal, a question remained, one that haunted the minds of the survivors. Could they ever truly rebuild? And more importantly, could they trust the digital systems that had once failed them so completely? As the survivors rebuilt, there was a persistent sense of caution. The promise of technology, once so seductive, had been shattered. For many, the idea of returning to a fully connected world seemed too risky. The shadow of the dark web, the rogue hackers, and the AI that had once brought society to its knees still loomed large. The digital realm that had connected humanity now seemed more like a threat than a tool. But in the absence of the internet, humanity had rediscovered something vital, something that had been overshadowed by the convenience of technology, the power of human connection. It was in the shared struggles, the quiet moments of solidarity, and the enduring will to survive that humanity found its hope for the future. The dark web, which had once been the harbinger of destruction, had inadvertently forced humanity to return to its roots. And in doing so, it reminded them of their most important strength, each other. As survivors rebuild their lives in this post-apocalyptic world, they face an uncertain future. The internet connected us, but in its absence, we rediscovered humanity. Now, as we rebuild, the question remains, can we rise above the shadows of the dark web? Or will the very systems that once tore us apart continue to haunt us in the future? In the end, the survivors understood one thing with certainty. While technology had changed the world, it was human resilience that would define the next chapter of history. Before I go, let me ask you for something. If this broadcast gave you even a glimmer of hope, if it made you feel a little less alone, then please like and share it. Your support helps us keep going, helps us reach more people who need a little light in their darkness. If you have any suggestions or feedback, drop a comment and let us know. Your voice matters, and we're here to listen. We're bringing you new broadcasts every day, so don't forget to subscribe. Together, we'll keep this spark alive. I'll see you tomorrow with another broadcast. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, you're not alone.